Page 123. The small militant groups that relaunched the Palestinian national movement in the 1950s and early 1960s put forward simple objectives for the struggle. For them, Palestine had long been an Arab land with an Arab majority. Its people had been unjustly dispossessed of their homes, their property, their homeland, and the right of self-determination. These groups' main purpose was to return the Palestinian people to their homeland, restore their rights, and oust those whom they saw as usurpers. The term return was central, as it had been for Palestinians ever since. Most felt no sense that there were now two peoples in Palestine, each with national rights. To them, Israelis were no more than settlers, foreign immigrants to their country. This position exactly mirrored that of most Israelis, for whom there was only one people with national rights in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and that was the Jewish people, while the Arabs were no more than transient interlopers. In the Palestinian reading of the day, Israel was a colonial settler project that the West had helped create and supported, which was largely true. And the Israeli Jews were part of a religious group only, not a people or a nation, which the successful creation of a powerful nation state with a strong national identity had already shown to be false. At this point, the Palestinians had not come to terms with the reality of a new national entity in Palestine, in part because this happened at their expense and at a ruinous cost to them. The culmination of this thinking about the objectives of the Palestinian struggle was articulated in the National Charter, Al-Mithaq al-Watani, adopted by the PLO in 1964. The charter stated that Palestine was an Arab country where national rights belonged only to those residing there before 1917 and their descendants. This group included Jews then resident in Palestine, but not those who had immigrated after the Balfour Declaration, who would therefore be obliged to leave. From this perspective, liberation involved the reversal of everything that had taken place in Palestine since the Balfour Declaration, the British Mandate, the partition of the country, and the Nakba. It meant turning back the clock and refashioning Palestine into an Arab country once more. Although the ideas the Charter embodied were reflective of much, perhaps most, Palestinian sentiment at the time, it was adopted by a body created by the Arab League, not one that was elected by or represented the Palestinians. These objectives would change rapidly with shifting circumstances and the transformations of Palestinian politics after 1964. With the takeover of the PLO by Fatah and the other resistant groups in 1968, the national movement formulated a new objective, advocating the idea of Palestine as a single democratic state for all its citizens, both Jews and Arabs. Some iterations referred to a secular democratic state. This was meant to supersede the aims laid down in the National Charter, recognizing that Israeli Jews had acquired the right to live in Palestine and could not be made to leave. The change was also meant to refashion the PLO's image and appeal to Israelis, who were treated by the 1964 National Charter as if they did not exist. The statement that Jews and Arabs living in Palestine were entitled to be equal citizens of the country represented a major evolution of the movement's thinking. However, the single democratic state proposal did not recognize the Israelis as people with national rights, nor did it accept the legitimacy of the State of Israel or Zionism. Over time, this new objective came to be broadly accepted among Palestinians and was embodied in successive authoritative pronouncements of PLO policy via resolutions of the PNC. In the end, it superseded the Charter and rendered it obsolete. Yet these fundamental changes were resolutely ignored by the PLO's opponents, who continued to harp on the Charter's original provisions for decades to come. The change also achieved little traction with most Israelis and failed to convince many in the West. Again, the inability of the PLO leadership to understand how important these audiences were and its unwillingness to devote sufficient resources to explaining the significance of this evolution in order to win them over, doomed any effort to convince others of the validity of these aims. More important, achieving an objective of this magnitude would require the dissolution of Israel with the new state of Palestine taking its place. This would mean overturning that since 1947 had become an international consensus around the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, as specified by the wording of GA 181. Only a revolutionary shift in the balance of forces both within Israel and globally could accomplish such an end, something that the Palestinians could hardly achieve or even contemplate on their own. And they could not count on their brothers in the Arab regimes. Radical Arab states such as Syria, Iraq, and Libya continued to talk a big game where the Palestine cause was concerned, but their rhetoric was empty. What these states actually did was to sabotage the PLO by sponsoring nihilistic terrorist groups such as the Abu Nidal organization, which assassinated numerous PLO leaders and killed Israelis and Jews indiscriminately. As for the other key Arab states, Egypt and Jordan, with the support of Saudi Arabia, had by 1970 accepted SC 242, and Syria followed in 1973. This major development, unacknowledged by Israel, amounted to those states' de facto recognition of Israel, at least within the 1949 armistice lines. The dissonance between this crucial shift by several major Arab states and the PLO's position was to have grave consequences for the Palestinians. Changes in regional circumstances led many PLO leaders to consider a further modification of their objectives. A number of factors exerted an influence. The PLO's inability to sustain an effective guerrilla campaign against Israel after the loss of its bases in Jordan. The Arab states' growing acceptance of the conflict with Israel, not as existential, but as a state-to-state confrontation over frontiers. And Arab and international pressure on the PLO to conform to more limited objectives. At the Arab League's summit in Khartoum in 1967, the League had declared that there would be no peace, no recognition, and no negotiations with Israel. The three no's that were much repeated in Israeli propaganda. In reality, Egypt and Jordan would welcomed mediation with Israel through UN Special Envoy Gunnar Jarring and later via U.S. Secretary of State William Rogers. The Khartoum summit notwithstanding, the most powerful Arab country bordering Israel had, by accepting SC 242, conceded in principle that its neighbor had a right to secure and recognized boundaries. It remained only for the Arab states and Israel to negotiate those boundaries and the other terms of a settlement. The Jordanian crackdown on the Palestinians in September 1970, although provoked by the PFLP aircraft hijackings, was meant, among other things, to punish the Palestinians for not accepting the new limitations of the key Arab states' aims. Starting in the early 1970s, members of the PLO responded to these pressures, in particular to the urging of the Soviet Union, by floating the idea of a Palestinian state alongside Israel, in effect a two-state solution. This approach was notably promoted by the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which had split off from the PFLP in 1969, together with Syrian-backed groups, discreetly encouraged by the leadership of Fatah. Although there had been early resistance by the two-state solution by the PFLP and some Fatah cadres, in time it became clear that Arafat, among other leaders, supported it. This marked the beginning of a long, slow process of shifting away from the maximalist objective of the democratic state, with its revolutionary implications, to an ostensibly more pragmatic aim of a Palestinian state alongside Israel, to be achieved via negotiations on the basis of SC 242. The path toward these radical modifications was not an easy one for the PLO. Only after some of the most severe blows inflicted on the Palestinian national movement since the Nakba did the PLO come to accept a two-state approach based on SC 242. These blows came in quick succession during the Lebanese Civil War, which began formally in April 1975. However, for the Palestinians, the war began 2 years earlier, on April 10, 1973, with the assassination of 3 PLO leaders in their homes in West Beirut by Israeli commandos, led by Ehud Barak, later Israel's prime minister. The crowds of Palestinians and Lebanese attending the funerals of the poet and PLO spokesman Kamal Nasser and Fatah leaders Kamal Adwan and Abdu Yusuf Najjar were immense. As I walked with these masses of mourners, I was not surprised to see that they were even larger than those of Ghassan Kanafani. These 4 men were among the scores of Palestinian leaders and cadres who fell victim to the assassination squads of the Mossad. It is true that nominally Palestinian groups murdered other Palestinian figures, including 3 members of the Fatah Central Committee and the PLO ambassadors in London and to the Socialist International. These groups served as agents of the 3 dictatorial Arab regimes, those of Hafez al-Assad in Syria, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and Muammar al-Gaddafi in Libya, that were loud in their proclamation of support for the Palestinian cause, but harsh in their treatment of the PLO. These regimes were patrons at different times of the gunmen of the Abu Nidal organization, which did most of this killing, and other small splinter groups. While the impact of these assassinations by Israel and hostile Arab powers is a mark of the extraordinarily difficult path trodden by the Palestinian national movement, there is an important distinction between them. The Arab states that used such means wanted to bend the PLO to their will, even by using brute force. As when the Assad regime sent troops to confront the PLO in Lebanon in 1976. However, they operated on the basis of cold, calculating raison d'etat. They did not want to destroy the PLO or to extinguish the Palestinian cause. Israel's case was quite different, as this was always its objective. Its long-standing policy of liquidating Palestinian leaders, inherited from the Zionist movement during the late Mandate period, aimed at eliminating the Palestinian reality. Demographically, I don't know what that word is, ideationally and politically. Assassinations were thus a central element in Israel's ambition to transform the entire country, from the river to the sea, from an Arab to a Jewish one. To use Barak Kimmerling's term once again, this was an example of politicide in its most literal form. As evidence of the extent of the campaign of liquidations, we have 2 new accounts of it, one of them based on classified Israeli intelligence and military material. Among much else that is new, it contains sensational revelations about repeated attempts to assassinate Yasser Arafat. The pretext that such killings were a blow against terrorism simply do not wash when the target is the leader of a national movement, unless the aim is to destroy that movement. Leaders of other anti-colonial movements were invariably vilified by their colonial masters in similar terms: terrorists, bandits, and murderers. Whether they were Irish, Indian, Kenyan, or Algerian. Similarly, Israel's demonization of the PLO as terrorists served as a justification for its eradication. The private statements of Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon in 1982 about Palestinian terrorists in Beirut could not be clearer on this point. The justification of assassinations as necessary protection against terrorists who would kill if not killed first also rings hollow when many of those killed, Ghassan Kanafani and Kamal Nasser, for example, or PLO representatives abroad such as Mahmoud Hamshari and Wael Zuayatir, were intellectuals and advocates for the Palestine cause, rather than military personnel. Their artistic ventures were supplementary and linked to their political activities. Kanafani were supplementary and linked to their political activities. Kanafani was a gifted novelist and painter, Nasser a poet, Zuayatir a writer and budding translator. These were not terrorists, but the most prominent voices of a national movement, voices Israel was determined to stifle. In Lebanon, the assassinations of Nasser Adwan and Najjar in April 1973 were followed 1 month later by an armed confrontation with the Lebanese army, during which the Air Force strafed the Palestinian Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in the southern suburbs of Beirut. Throughout the remainder of the Lebanese Civil War, which dragged on until 1990, Palestinian refugee camps and population centers were a frequent target. Besieged, devastated, the scenes of massacres and forced expulsions. Tal al-Zatar, Karantina, Dibye, Jisr al-Basha, Ain al-Hilwa, Sabra, and Shatila, Palestinians in all these places suffered such atrocities. The war also brought horrific massacres of Lebanese Christians by factions of the PLO and its Lebanese allies, notably at Damour in January 1976, where hundreds of Christians were killed and the town was sacked and looted. Tal al-Zatar was the largest, poorest, and most isolated of the Palestinian refugee camps in the Beirut area, with a population of about 20,000 Palestinians and perhaps 10,000 impoverished Lebanese, mainly Shiites from the south. It was located in the East Beirut suburb of Dikwane, which was inhabited largely by Lebanese Maronites, sympathetic to the right-wing anti-Palestinian Phalangist Party. I was living in Beirut with my wife, Mona, in the years leading up to the Civil War, first working on my doctoral dissertation and then teaching at the Lebanese University and the American University of Beirut. With a group of friends, Palestinian graduate students and residents of Tal al-Zatar, we had opened the first preschool in the camp, backed by Jamiat Inash al-Mukhayam, a Lebanese Palestinian charitable organization. Relations between the camp and its surroundings became increasingly fraught as the situation in Lebanon deteriorated, and by May 1973, it was clear that Tal al-Zatar and the nearby Dibay and Jisr al-Basha refugee camps, as well as the Palestinian community in the Karantina area, were in decidedly hostile territory. Their neighbors deeply resented the presence of heavily armed Palestinian militiamen in the camps. In these perilous circumstances, we were all concerned about the safety of the small children in the preschool, so we dug a shelter beneath the center. Several other groups, and eventually the PLO, also built shelters, which saved many lives when the war broke out in earnest in 1975. One Sunday in April that year, Mona and I were having lunch in Tal al-Zatar at the home of the parents of our friend Kasim when we heard that there had been an incident on the road that led to the camp, which ran through the mainly Maronite suburb of Ain al-Rumaneh. We were advised to leave immediately. Driving back the West Bay route in our old VW Beetle, we spotted a small bus stopped at an awkward angle in the middle of the road. It had just been ambushed on its way back to Tel al-Zatar by Phalangelist militiamen, who had killed all of its 27 passengers. It transpired that the Phalangists had taken revenge for a shooting at a Maronite church nearby where the leader, Pierre Guimael, had been present. Thus began the 15-year Lebanese Civil War. We were never able to return to Tal al-Zatar, besieged by what came to be called the Lebanese forces, headed by Pierre Guimael's son, Bashir. The camp was overrun in August 1976, and its entire population was expelled. Perhaps 2,000 people were killed in what was probably the largest single massacre during the entire war. Some died during the siege, some when they fled the camp, and some at LF checkpoints, where Palestinians were picked up and taken away to be murdered. 2 of the teachers from our preschool were killed in this way, as was Jihad, Qasim's 11-year-old niece, who was kidnapped and murdered at a roadblock together with her mother. The LF carried out the Tal al-Zatar massacre with Israel's covert support. Years later, in 1982, facing parliamentary attacks by Labour Party leaders, Ariel Sharon upheld his conduct during the notorious Sabra and Shatila massacres in September of that year, in which over 1,000 civilians were killed, by pointing to the Israeli government's support for the Phalangists at the time of the 1976 killings in Tal al-Zatar. In a secret meeting of the Knesset Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee, Sharon revealed that Israel's military intelligence officers, who were on the spot at the time of the Tal al-Zatar massacre, reported that the Phalangists were killing people, quote, with the weapons we supplied and the forces we helped them build, unquote. Sharon went on to say to Shimon Peres, leader of the opposition Labour Party, which had been in power in 1976, quote, you and us are acting according to the same moral principles. The Phalangists murdered in Shatila and the Phalangists murdered in Tel Zatar. The link is a moral one. Should we get involved with the Phalangists or not, you supported them and continue to do so after Tel Zatar, unquote. While Israeli military and intelligence officers may not have been inside the camps, as Sharon pointed out to the Knesset committee, they were present at the command posts for which both operations were directed. According to Hassan Sabri al-Khalidi, the horrified Arab League mediator in Lebanon, who was present in the LF operations room and tried to halt the 1976 massacre as it was taking place, Israeli officers and 2 Syrian liaison personnel, Colonel Ali Madani and Colonel Mohammed Kohli, were there at that time. Few images are more symbolic of the odds faced by the Palestinians during the Lebanon War than that of Israeli and Syrian officers, whose coexistence in Lebanon had been brokered by Henry Kissinger to, quote, break the back, unquote, of the PLO, looking on as LF commanders directed a massacre at a Palestinian refugee camp. But as Kissinger said in another context, quote, covert action should not be confused with missionary work, unquote. The war in Lebanon had multiple protagonists, Lebanese and non-Lebanese, each one with different objectives, but for a number of them, the PLO was a major target. To those Lebanese who opposed the PLO, most of them Maronite Christians, their resistance to the armed Palestinian presence was carried out in the name of Lebanese nationalism and independence. As most Palestinian refugees in Lebanon were Sunni Muslims, and because the secular PLO was allied with Lebanese leftists and Muslim groups, the Maronites feared a disruption of the country's sectarian political system which the French mandate had rigged in their favor in the early 1920s. To Syria, Lebanon was a vital strategic arena it sought to dominate, a potential point of vulnerability in the conflict with Israel, and the site of its struggle with the PLO over leadership of the Arab Front against Israel. These became crucial issues for Damascus as Egypt moved inexorably toward a separate peace with Israel, and in effect became the U.S. client state it had been ever since. While losing its Egyptian ally, Syria needed to find another counterweight to Israel and domination of Lebanon, the Palestinians, and Jordan may have seemed like the only viable option. The boundless mistrust between the Syrian president Hafez al-Assad and the PLO's Arafat exacerbated the situation, as did the PLO's backing of Lebanese leftist formations, which were thereby enabled to take a position more independent of Damascus. For the Israeli government, indirect and direct involvement in the Lebanon war furnished a welcome opportunity to acquire Lebanese clients, develop a new sphere of influence, and weaken Syria and its allies. Most important, the war provided an opening to retaliate against the PLO's sporadic attacks on Israelis, undermining and perhaps crippling it. This would also neutralize the threat that Palestinian nationalism posed to Israel's permanent control of the occupied territories, where millions more restive Palestinians had come under Israel's rule after 1967. The PLO's attacks, launched from Lebanon, which often targeted civilians, gave different Israeli governments all the provocation they needed to justify interventions against their northern neighbor. Israeli methods ranged from direct support in the form of arms and training for the PLO's foes, notably the LF, which received equipment worth $118.5 million in training for 1,300 militiamen, according to an official Israeli source, to the assassinations and car bombings that killed Palestinian leaders and countless civilians. Senior Israeli military and intelligence personnel recounted details of some of these operations in a book in which the chapter on Lebanon is entitled, quote, "A Pack of Wild Dogs," unquote. The references to how Israeli operatives described their allies in the LF, which they employed for many of the most gruesome of these lethal operations. The United States supported Israel's goals in Lebanon under Nixon, Ford, and Kissinger, and later under Carter, Vance, and Brzezinski, as well as during the Reagan administration. Brzezinski. The two essential objectives of U.S. Middle East policy were to woo the most important Arab state, Egypt, away from the Soviet Union, while not allowing the Middle East conflict to complicate d'entente with the USSR. This required steering Egypt toward acceptance of Israel. Egypt's complete alignment with the U.S. would let American leaders claim that they had won the Cold War in the Middle East while establishing a Pax Americana. Given the magnitude and importance to Washington of these strategic objectives, the PLO's opposition was a relatively minor obstacle, and there were plenty of Middle Eastern parties that were happy to help the United States by acting against it. With the explicit approval of the United States, one of these parties, Syria, launched a direct military assault on the PLO in Lebanon in 1976, as the civil war there was already underway. While Washington and Syria were working toward an understanding about this intervention, Kissinger clarified U.S. objectives. Quote, "We can let the Syrians move and break the back of the PLO," unquote. This was, he said, quote, "a strategic opportunity which we shall miss," unquote. In the end, the United States did not let the opportunity slip away, and Syrian troops engaged in pitched battles with the Palestinian commandos in Sidon and the Shuf Mountains and elsewhere. The Syrian intervention was only made possible after Kissinger persuaded Israel not to oppose it via tacit agreement on red lines that set geographical limits to the Syrian advance. The involvement of the United States in hostilities against the Palestinians long preceded its green light to Syria in 1976. Henry Kissinger had no place for the PLO or for the resolution of the Palestinian problem in his Cold War-driven framework for the Middle East. For him, the Palestinians, in league with the Soviets and radical Arab regimes, were at worst a hindrance to be removed, and at best a problem to be ignored. In furtherance of the American Cold War aims, and in his single-minded pursuit of these goals, Kissinger was instrumental in negotiating three important disengagement agreements between Israel and Egypt and Syria after the 1973 war, which were precursors to a separate Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. To achieve this, Kissinger sought only to contain the Palestinian issue, prevent it from interfering with his diplomacy, and render it manageable, if necessary, by the use of force exerted by a range of proxies. This was the case in Jordan from the late 1960s until 1971, and later in Lebanon in early to mid-1970s, when the PLO opposed Egypt's U.S.-encouraged drift toward a direct settlement with Israel. In both cases, Kissinger colluded with America's local allies to crush the Palestinian movement. Standing behind all of them in the shadows, often indirectly responsible, was the United States. Still, Kissinger admitted in his memoirs that the Palestinians' fate, quote, fate was, after all, their origin of the crisis, unquote. And as anyone who followed his long career can attest, he was nothing if not a pragmatist. Even as he was negotiating the terms of Syria's military intervention against the Palestinians in 1975, Kissinger also authorized covert, indirect talks with the PLO. These contacts were necessarily clandestine because of a pledge the Secretary of State had made in a secret U.S.-Israel memorandum of agreement in September that year. According to this pledge, the United States promised not to reorganize or negotiate with the Palestine Liberation Organization, unquote, until the PLO recognized Israel's, quote, right to exist, unquote, abjured from the use of force, quoted as terrorism, and accepted SC Resolutions 242 and 338, which, passed in 1973, reaffirmed SC 242 and called for, quote, negotiations between the parties concerned under appropriate auspices, unquote, meaning a multilateral peace conference later convened at Geneva. Notwithstanding this clandestine promise to Israel, soon after Kissinger asked President Gerald Ford to approve U.S. contact with the PLO, he argued that there would be no change in our position toward the PLO on the Middle East question, but we have no commitment to Israel not to talk to the PLO exclusively about the situation in Lebanon, unquote. Ostensibly, the purpose of these contacts was to ensure the security of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut and of American citizens during the Lebanese Civil War, which the PLO undertook to do. Over several subsequent years, there was extensive coordination between intelligence personnel from the two sides about such security provided by the PLO. When these dealings became known, Israel's response was harshly critical, but the U.S. government affirmed their limited nature. However, U.S. PLO contacts rapidly expanded well beyond these original limited aims to encompass the general political situation in Lebanon. In 1977, the U.S. ambassador in Beirut, Richard Parker, was tasked with maintaining contacts regarding a variety of political issues through intermediaries affiliated with the PLO. Among them, a professor at the AUB, a prominent Palestinian businessman. There can be little question that despite Kissinger's justification, U.S. discussions with the PLO violated the terms of the 1975 Memorandum of Agreement with Israel. Once the Israeli government discovered what was going on, it reacted forcefully to this betrayal as they saw it. In January 1979, Israeli agents in Beirut assassinated Abu Hassan Salami, the key PLO figure involved in these contacts, by bombing his car, causing a huge explosion that resulted in a ball of fire. Salame had been the head of Yasser Arafat's personal security service, Force 17, and Israel claimed that he had been involved in the 1972 attack on Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. However, an account based on interviews with Israeli intelligence officers involved in the operations state that, quote, the Mossad eventually reached the conclusion that cutting this channel was important, to give the Americans a hint that this was no way to behave towards friends, unquote. The assassination did not end the contacts, although they became even more deeply shrouded in secrecy, as both the United States and the PLO took the heavy-handed Israeli hint. In 1978, John Gunther Dean, Parker's successor as ambassador to Lebanon, was ordered to continue the channels of communication, which broadened to include the first direct interactions between American and PLO officials, and came to address an even wider range of political topics. Among these were the terms for PLO acceptance of SC-242 and for U.S. recognition of the PLO, the inclusion of the PLO in peace negotiations, the Iranian Islamic Revolution, and freeing American hostages being held in Tehran. For at least 4 years, the United States was clandestinely negotiating with the PLO, its pledge to Israel notwithstanding. Dean was the target of an assassination attempt in 1980. The Front for the Liberation of Lebanon from Foreigners claimed responsibility, but this group was later identified in interviews with Israeli intelligence sources as an Israeli-controlled operation. Dean always maintained that Israel was behind the attempt to kill him, and this evidence, in addition to Israel's assassination of several Palestinians involved in contacts with the United States, appears to bear out Dean's claim. Correspondence with the State Department during 1979, to which Dean provided me access, illustrates the extent of these U.S. PLO contacts in ways that are not fully reflected in the official State Department documentary series, Foreign Relations of the United States. They include, for example, extensive exchanges on PLO efforts to free American hostages held in the embassy in Tehran, a number of whom were apparently released at least in part because of Palestinian intercession with the Iranian revolutionary regime. While the contacts began via intermediaries, they led to direct meetings between Dean and, among others, Brigadier Saad Sael Abdul El-Walid, a former Jordanian army officer, the PLO's chief of staff, and its senior military officer. He too was later assassinated, perhaps by Syrian agents or possibly by those of Israel. As important as the extent of range of the exchanges was their tenor, the Palestinian intermediaries involved talked at length with Dean and one of his colleagues about terms for the PLO's acceptance of SC-242. It was willing to do this with some reservations, and how that could lead to official, open U.S.-Palestinian contacts. Agreement on this matter was never reached. The Palestinians involved repeatedly relayed the PLO's desire for recognition from Washington of its efforts on behalf of U.S. interests, but Dean was authorized only to express his government's gratitude for the provision of security to American institutions. The United States never offered the political recompense for these services that the Palestinian leadership apparently expected. While American contacts were ongoing with the PLO in Beirut, President Jimmy Carter's administration worked to hold a multilateral Middle East peace conference in Geneva, issued a joint communique with the USSR in October 1977. The communique broke ground, referring to participation of all parties to the conflict, including, quote, those of the Palestinian people, unquote. A statement made by Carter some months earlier, calling for a homeland for the Palestinians, signaled a different tone in Washington. However, under pressure from the newly elected Likud government in Israel, led by Menachem Begin, and from Egypt's Anwar Sadat, the administration soon abandoned its push for a comprehensive settlement and the inclusion of the Palestinians in negotiations. Instead, it adopted the bilateral Camp David process, resulting in the separate Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty of 1979. This process was specifically designed by Begin to freeze out the PLO, allow unimpeded colonization of the occupied territories occupied in 1967, and put the Palestine issues on hold, which is where it remained for over a decade. While Sadat and American officials feebly protested the sidetracking of the Palestinian issue, whose importance Carter had stressed at the outset of his presidency, in the end they acquiesced. For Sadat, the treaty restored the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. For Begin, the unilateral Egyptian peace strengthened Israel's control of the rest of the occupied territories and permanently removed Egypt from the Arab-Israeli conflict. For the United States, the treaty completed Egypt's shift from the Soviet to the American camp, diffusing the most dangerous aspects of the superpower conflict in the Middle East. Given the vital importance of these national goals to all three parties, Begin was allowed to dictate the terms where Palestine was concerned at Camp David and in the 1979 peace treaty. All of this was apparent to the PLO leadership, and later phases of their indirect interaction with the United States government reflected their increasing bitterness. They saw that the PLO's cooperation in Lebanon, far from having been reciprocated, was in fact repaid with further isolation of the organization by the United States and its Israeli ally. Although under Carter, the United States had come close to endorsing the Palestinians' national rights and their involvement in negotiations, the two sides found themselves farther apart than ever. Camp David and the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty signaled U.S. alignment with the most extreme expression of Israel's negation of Palestinian rights, an alignment that was consolidated by Ronald Reagan's administration. Begin and his successors in the Likud, Yitzhak Shamir, Ariel Sharon, and then Benjamin Netanyahu, were implacably opposed to Palestinian statehood, sovereignty, or control of the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. Ideological heirs of Sayev, Jabotinsky, they believed that the entirety of Palestine belonged solely to the Jewish people and that a Palestinian people with national rights did not exist. At most, autonomy might be possible for the local Arabs, but this autonomy would apply only to people, not to the land. Their explicit aim was to transform the entirety of Palestine into the land of Israel. Via the treaty with Egypt, Begin ensured that nothing would interfere with the implementation of the Likud vision, the foundation he had cannily laid down, which was adopted by the United States, formed the basis of everything that would follow. Future negotiations would be restricted to the terms of self-rule for an infinitely extendable interim period and exclude any discussion of sovereignty, statehood, Jerusalem, the fate of refugees, and jurisdiction over the land, water, and air of Palestine. Meanwhile, Israel set about reinforcing its colonization of the occupied territories. In spite of occasional meek American and Egyptian protestations, the conditions imposed by Begin set the ceiling of what the Palestinians were allowed to negotiate for. In the wake of 1979 peace treaty, conditions became even worse for the Palestinians. The Lebanon war ground on, destroying much of the country, exhausting its people, and debilitating the PLO. At different stages, the PLO found itself facing the Israeli, Syrian, and Lebanese armies, as well as Lebanese militias supported covertly by an array of states, including the United States, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Nevertheless, after all this and despite an Israeli incursion in 1978, the Litani operation, which left a swath of South Lebanon under control of its proxy, the South Lebanese Army, the PLO was still standing. Indeed, it remained the strongest force in large parts of Lebanon. Those that were not in the hands of foreign armies or their proxies, including West Beirut, Tripoli, Sidon, the Shuf Mountains, and much of the south. It would take one more military campaign to dislodge the PLO, and in 1982, American Secretary of State General Alexander Haig agreed to Ariel Sharon's plans for Israel to finish off the organization and with it, Palestinian nationalism. You're not seeing this any differently than I am. Very difficult to see. I'm, assuming you're referring to this area. It says area occupied by Israel and South Lebanese Army, 1982 to 2000. The Fourth Declaration of War, 1982. The attack or bombardment of towns, villages, habitations, or dwellings which are undefended is prohibited. Article 25, annexed to the Hague Convention, July 29, 1899. You are afraid to tell our readers and those who might complain to you that the Israelis are capable of indiscriminately shelling an entire city. New York Times Beirut Bureau Chief Thomas Friedman to his editors. By 1982, Beirutis had lived through many years of war. They were used to the sound of explosions and had learned from experience to distinguish among them. On June 4th that year, a Friday, I was in a meeting of the admissions committee at the American University of Beirut, where I had been teaching for the past 6 years. It seemed like a routine end of the week. Suddenly, we heard the thunderous sound of what must have been 2,000-pound bombs exploding in the distance. We quickly recognized the gravity of what was happening, and the meeting broke up immediately. This aerial bombardment was the opening salvo in Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, directed against the PLO. Everyone in the country had long been expecting it, and most had been dreading it. Our two daughters, Lamia, who was 5.5, and Dima, then almost 3, were at kindergarten and nursery school in different places. With the screeching roar of supersonic warplanes diving to attack in the background, one of the most terrifying sounds on earth, I rushed to my car to pick the girls up from their schools. Everyone on the road that day drove with the heedless abandon they always displayed when the fighting started up again in Beirut. That is, they drove only slightly more recklessly than usual. My wife, Mona, then in her 4th month of pregnancy, was at work at Wafa, the PLO Palestine news agency, where she was chief editor of its English language bulletin. As best as I could tell, the colossal explosions rocking the Lebanese capital seemed to be coming from the teeming Fakani district of West Beirut a couple of miles away. Adjacent to the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, the Wafa office was located there, as were most of the PLO's information and political offices. The site of the explosions were soon confirmed by radio reports. The Beirut telephone system, never very reliable and even less so after 7 years of war, was so overloaded that I could not get through to Mona. I had no way to reach her and no idea of what was happening. I hoped she had taken shelter in the basement of the rundown Wafa building. Luckily, the AUB was close to the girls' school. Mona and I were always anxious about being able to reach them quickly whenever the on-again, off-again fighting began. During the first few years of the intermittent war in Lebanon, we had never been afraid for ourselves, but there was always constant worry once the girls started going to school. Our daughters, and later our son, were born in Beirut in the midst of the war, and by virtue of the fact of having parents who were politically involved, as were almost all of the 300,000 or so Palestinians in Lebanon, they were seen as terrorists by the Israeli government and some others, as were Mona and I. To my distress, those most likely to label us in this way were now preparing to invade the city. Although it could almost have been a normal Beirut Friday school pickup, even with the shuddering explosions and distances, I knew that our lives would not be normal for quite a while. I soon had the girls safely at home, and my mother and I calmed them as well as we could against the relentless, thunderous noise outside. When Mona finally got home, I learned that in spite of the heavy aerial bombardment, she had decided not to heed advice to go down to a basement shelter. From her experience over many years of war, she knew that a prolonged assault, as that one was, would mean she could be stuck there and separated from the girls for many hours. So instead, she slipped out of the office and started off for home. With everyone in the street running away from the bombing and no cars or taxis in sight, she ran too. A breathless mile or so away, near the UNESCO offices, she found a cab willing to stop and take her the rest of the way safely. This experience had no apparent effect on the baby she was carrying, our son Ismail, who was born a few months later, although for a very long time after, he remained extremely sensitive to loud sounds. On that Friday, Israeli warplanes bombed and flattened dozens of buildings, including a sports stadium near the Fakani neighborhood, on the pretext that they housed PLO offices and facilities. The intense bombardment of targets in Beirut and the south of Lebanon that continued into the next day were the prelude to a massive ground assault starting on June 6, which ultimately led to Israel's occupation of much of Lebanon. The offensive culminated in a 7-week siege of Beirut that finally ended with a ceasefire on August 12th. During the siege, entire apartment buildings were obliterated and large areas devastated in the western half of the already badly damaged city. Nearly 50,000 people were killed or wounded in Beirut and the rest of Lebanon, while the siege constituted the most serious attack by a regular army on an Arab capital since World War II. It was not equaled until the U.S. occupation of Baghdad in 2003. The 1982 invasion of Lebanon was a watershed in the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. It was the first major war since May 15, 1948, to mainly involve the Palestinians rather than armies of the Arab states. Palestinian Fedayeen had faced Israeli troops in combat from the mid-1960s on, in Crimea and Jordan and southern Lebanon in the late 1960s and the 1970s, notably in the 1978 Litani operation, and in the furious exchange of fire across the Lebanese-Israeli border in the summer of 1981. In spite of the repeated attempts to uproot the PLO, however, it had built up such a position of strength in Lebanon, both politically and militarily, that relatively limited operations of this nature had made only a minimal impact. The invasion in 1982 was of an entirely different order in terms of its aims, scale, and duration. The heavy losses involved and its long-range impact. Israel's war on Lebanon had multiple objectives, but what distinguished it was its primary focus on the Palestinians and its larger goal of changing the situation inside Palestine. While the general scheme for the war was approved by Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and the Israeli cabinet, they were often kept in the dark by the invasion's architect, defense minister, Ariel Sharon, regarding both his real goals and his operational plans. Although Sharon, wanted to expel the PLO and Syrian forces from Lebanon and create a pliable allied government in Beirut to transform circumstances in the country, his chief objective was Palestine itself. From the perspective of proponents of Greater Israel such as Sharon, Begin, and Yitzhak Shamir, destroying the PLO militarily and eliminating its power in Lebanon would also put an end to the strength of Palestinian nationalism in the occupied West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. These areas would thereby become far easier for Israel to control and ultimately annex. Former Israeli Chief of Staff Mordecai Ger, speaking to a secret session of a Knesset committee at the outset of the war, approvingly summed up its purpose in, quote, the occupied territories. In the final analysis, the idea was to limit the PLO leadership's influence in order to provide us with greater freedom of action, unquote. In scale, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon involved the equivalent of 8 divisions, well over 120,000 troops, a large proportion of them reservists, the country's largest mobilization since the 1973 war. For the first couple of weeks of war, this massive force engaged in intermittent but fierce battles with a few thousand Palestinian and Lebanese fighters in southern Lebanon, and in ferocious combat with 2 divisions of Syrian armor and infantry in the Bekaa Valley, in the mountains of the Shuf and the Meton districts of Beirut. On June 26, Syria accepted a ceasefire which explicitly excluded the PLO and sat on the sidelines for the rest of the war. The subsequent siege of Beirut involved air and artillery bombardments of the city and sporadic ground combat solely with the forces of the PLO and its Lebanese allies. During the 10 weeks of fighting from early June through mid-August 1982, according to Lebanese official statistics, more than 19,000 Palestinians and Lebanese, mostly civilians, were killed and more than 30,000 wounded. The strategically located Ain al-Hilwa Palestinian refugee camp near Sudan, the largest in Lebanon with over 40,000 residents, was almost entirely destroyed after its population offered fierce resistance to the Israeli advance. In September, a similar fate befell the twin Sabra and Shatila camps in the Beirut suburbs, scene of an infamous and grisly massacre after the fighting had supposedly ended. Beirut and many other areas in the south and the Shuf Mountains sustained severe damage, while Israeli forces periodically cut off water, electricity, food, and fuel to the besieged western part of the Lebanese capital as they intermittently, but at times very intensively, bombarded it from air, land, and sea. The official Israeli toll of military casualties during the 10 weeks of war and siege totaled more than 2,700, with 364 soldiers killed and nearly 2,400 wounded. The invasion of Lebanon and the subsequent lengthy occupation of the southern part of the country, which ended only in 2000, involved Israel's third highest military casualty toll among the 6 major wars in its 70-plus year history. Throughout the 10 weeks of bombardment and the siege of West Beirut, my family, Mona, our 2 daughters, my mother, Selwa, my younger brother, Raja, and I, stayed together in our apartment in the built-up Zarif neighborhood of West Beirut. The front lines had come uncomfortably close to my mother's home in the southern suburb of Harat Rek, forcing her and my brother to move in with us. When we were able to visit their apartment after the fighting ended, we found that the kitchen had suffered a direct hit from an Israeli artillery shell. Being together meant that each of us in the family knew where the others were at all times, and we could help keep our general morale, despite the many privations of the siege, caring for two little children cooped up at home, coping with the acute shortages of water, electricity, and fresh food, and the stench of burning garbage, which we withstood along with hundreds of thousands of other West Beirutis. We had endured years of civil war, weathering heavy bombardments and even Israeli air attacks, but this siege, with its volume of Israeli artillery, fire from land and sea, and the relentless aerial bombing, was far more intense and ferocious. During this existential crisis for the Palestinian cause, which felt to many of us as if life and death hung in the balance, I acted as an off-the-record source for Western journalists, with some of whom I had become friends with over the years. Free from the obligation to present the PLO's official line, but still in close touch with colleagues at WAFA, where I had once worked, I was able to provide my own frank assessment of events. Meanwhile, Mona continued to edit the WAFA English language news bulletin, although given her pregnancy, it was now far too dangerous for her to go to the old office in the Fakani neighborhood, and she had to work remotely. It was fortunate for the presentation of the Palestinian point of view that Beirut had always been the journalistic nerve center of much of the Middle East, as well as a center for espionage, with most journalists located in the western part of the city. Among them were veteran war correspondents who had covered the Arab, Israeli, and Lebanese conflicts for many years and were mostly immune to obvious propaganda, whether it be the unsubtle messaging of the PLO, the harsh rhetoric of the Maronite Lebanese front, the formulaic bluster of the Syrian regime, or the slick, devious Hezbollah that Israel had mastered. Because of their presence in Beirut, the course of the war was well covered by the international media. The previous July, Israel and the PLO had engaged in an intense 2-week exchange of fire across the border, with Israel's aviation and artillery pounding South Lebanon and PLO rocket and artillery units hitting targets across northern Israel. In consequence, large numbers of Lebanese and Palestinian civilians had been forced to flee their homes, while Israelis in Galilee were confined to shelters or fled. This fierce fighting culminated in a July 25, 1981, ceasefire negotiated by U.S. Presidential Envoy Ambassador Philip Habib, which, remarkably, held for the next 10 months with very few violations. However, it was clear that Begin government and Ariel Sharon were not satisfied with this outcome. Warnings of Israeli war preparations had reached Lebanese and Palestinian leaders, the media, and others. One of these warnings was delivered in a spring 1982 briefing for researchers that I attended at the Institute for Palestine Studies. It was delivered by Dr. Yevgeny Primakov, who was director of the Soviet Oriental Institute and reputed to be a senior officer of the KGB. Primakov was blunt. Israel would soon attack Lebanon. The United States would fully support it, and the USSR did not have the capability to prevent the attack or to protect its Lebanese and Palestinian allies. Moscow, he said, would be hard-pressed to prevent the war from extending to Syria or to preserve its main regional ally, the Syrian regime. We were told that he had said much the same things to the PLO leadership. So none of us should have been surprised when the war started with the bombing of Beirut on June 4, 1982. Although the scope and scale of what followed was much greater than I and others expected. By contrast, Yasser Arafat and other PLO leaders had long understood that when war came, Sharon would push his army all the way to Beirut. They had clearly been preparing for this eventuality, stockpiling ammunition, supplies, moving offices and files, and preparing shelters and backup command centers. Starting on June 6th, Israel's immense armored columns, often preceded by amphibious and helicopter landings of commandos, pushed northward rapidly beyond Sidon, along the coast toward Beirut. Other Israeli armored units simultaneously advanced through the Shuf Mountains in the center of the country, while still others fought up the Bekaa Valley to the east. The invading force of 8 divisions enjoyed absolute superiority in numbers and equipment on all fronts, as well as complete control of the air and sea. Although difficult terrain or heavily built-up areas combined in determined resistance could briefly hinder such a forceful offensive, only very heavy Israeli casualties would have potentially slowed, if not stopped it. Thus, on June 13th, Israeli troops arrived at the strategic Khalidi intersection on the coast road just south of Beirut, where Palestinian, Lebanese, and Syrian combatants were eventually overwhelmed. Israeli tanks and artillery soon after appeared near the presidential palace in Ba'abda and in other suburbs in the eastern part of the capital. Western Beirut was now encircled, and the siege was about to begin. Following the Israeli offensive that drove Syrian forces out of the mountain towns overlooking Beirut and into separate ceasefire, the PLO was alone in the field with its allies in the Lebanese national movement. The siege was tightening. Israeli forces bombarded West Beirut seemingly at will, and there was no prospect of relief or meaningful support from any quarter. In certain cases, the Israeli shelling and bombing were carefully targeted, sometimes on the basis of good intelligence. All too often, however, that was not the case. Scores of 8 to 12-story apartment buildings were destroyed in airstrikes all over the western part of the city, especially in Fakani Arab University District, hitting many empty PLO offices as well as residential homes. Many of the buildings that were leveled there and elsewhere along the shore in the Raush neighborhood, for example, where my cousin Walid's apartment was destroyed by an artillery shell, had no plausible military utility. Although his editors at the New York Times removed the offending word from his article, reporter Thomas Friedman at one point described the Israeli bombardment as, quote, indiscriminate, unquote. He was referring specifically to the sporadic shelling of neighborhoods like the area around the Commodore Hotel, where he and most journalists were staying, and which certainly contained nothing whatsoever of military interest. The only possible objective of such blanket bombardment was to terrorize the population of Beirut and turn it against the PLO. In spite of this firestorm, and even with Israel's extensive aerial surveillance capabilities and its many hundreds of agents and spies planted in Lebanon, the war took place before the age of reconnaissance drone. Not one of the PLO's several functioning underground command and control posts or its multiple communication centers was ever hit. Nor was a single PLO leader killed in the attacks, although many civilians died when the Israeli Air Force missed its targets. This is surprising given just how extensive were Israel's efforts to liquidate them. Israel's leaders were clearly unconcerned about killing civilians trying to do so. After an air attack in July 1981 destroyed a building in Beirut where heavy civilian casualties, Begin's office had stated that Israel was no longer refraining from attacking guerrilla targets in civilian areas. Arafat himself was a prime target. In an August 5th letter to Ronald Reagan, Begin wrote that these days he felt as if he and his valiant army were facing Berlin, where, amongst innocent civilians, Hitler and his henchmen hide in a bunker deep beneath the surface. Begin often drew such parallels between Arafat and Hitler. If Arafat was another Hitler, then killing him was certainly permissible and justified, whatever the cost in civilian lives. One of Israel's most notorious supposed spies, known to Beirutis as Abu Rish, father of the feather, he sometimes wore a feather in his cap, often camped out opposite my mother-in-law's apartment building in the Menara district of West Beirut, and sometimes even in her lobby. His eccentric appearance was familiar to passerby and to my daughters, watching him from the balcony above, remember him more than 35 years later. Some Beirutis reported seeing him later guiding Israeli troops, although that may have been an urban legend. In an interview with me in Tunis 2 years after the war, Chief of PLO Intelligence Abu Iyad Salah Khalaf helped explain why Israel may have failed to hit some of its intended targets for all its vaunted intelligence services. During the siege, the PLO had managed to obtain a continuous flow of fuel, food supplies, and munitions by transferring them across lines controlled by a branch of the mainly Maronite Lebanese front, which was allied with Israel. It was a simple matter of money, he said in his rumbling, low smoker's voice, and the systematic use of double agents, the employment of whom might have also had something to do with the high survival rate of PLO leaders. But one should never trust a double agent, he told me. Anyone you can buy can be bought again. In a cruel irony, it was a double agent who had been turned again who assassinated Abu Iyad in Tunis in 1991. Toward the end of the siege, on August 6th, I was near a half-finished 8-story apartment building a few blocks from where we lived when a precision-guided munition demolished it. I had stopped to drop off a friend at his parked car not far from the building. I had almost reached home as planes swooped down and I heard a huge explosion behind me. Later, I saw that the entire building was flattened, pancaked into a single mound of smoking rubble. The structure, which had been full of Palestinian refugees from Sabra and Shatila, had reportedly just been visited by Arafat. At least 100 people, probably more, were killed, most of them women and children. Days later, my friend told me that immediately after the air attack, just as he got into his car, shaken but unhurt, a car bomb exploded nearby, presumably having been set to kill the rescuers who were helping families trying to find their loved ones in the rubble. Such car bombs, a weapon of choice for the Israeli forces besieging Beirut, and one of their most terrifying instruments of death and destruction, were described by one Mossad officer as killing for killing's sake. This dirty war continued until the PLO was forced to agree to evacuate Beirut. Under intense pressure from Israel, the United States, and their Lebanese allies, and in the absence of meaningful support from any Arab government. The exit negotiations took place primarily via Ambassador Habib's exchanges with Lebanese intermediaries, but also involved France and some Arab governments, notably Saudi Arabia and Syria. Until the end, and despite some shifts in the American cast of characters and attitude toward Israel, the United States remained committed to achieving Israel's core war aim, the defeat of the PLO and its expulsion from Beirut. Israel demanded complete and virtually unconditional PLO withdrawal from the city, an aim which the United States fully endorsed. Employing Cold War tropes that they knew would resonate in Washington, Begin and Sharon, had early on convinced President Reagan and his administration that the PLO was a terrorist group aligned with the evil Soviet Empire and that its elimination would be a service to both the United States and Israel. All U.S. diplomacy during the war flowed from that shared conviction. The PLO thus faced not only fierce military pressure from Israel, but also remitting diplomatic coercion from Israel's U.S. ally. That coercion was intense and constant, and it was accompanied by Israeli and American campaigns of disinformation and deception about the course of negotiations designed to sap Palestinian and Lebanese morale and precipitate a quick surrender. Meanwhile, the United States also provided indispensable material support to its ally, to the tune of $1.4 billion in military aid annually in both 1981 and 1982. This paid for the myriad of U.S. weapon systems and munitions deployed in Lebanon by Israel, from F-16 fighter bombers to M113 armored personnel carriers, 155mm and 175mm artillery, air-to-ground missiles, and cluster munitions. Beyond the intertwined roles of Israel and the United States, one of the shabbiest and most shameful subsidiary aspects of the war was the capitulation of the leading Arab regimes to American pressure. Their governments loudly proclaimed the support of the Palestinian cause, but did nothing to back the PLO as it stood alone. But for its Lebanese allies against Israel's military onslaught, and as an Arab capital was besieged, bombarded, and occupied. They did no more than issue pro forma objections as the United States championed Israeli demands to expel the PLO from Beirut. The Arab League foreign ministers, meeting on July 13th in preparation for the Arab Summit later that year, proposed no action in response to the war, which by then had been ongoing for over 5 weeks. Instead, the Arab states meekly acquiesced. This was notably true of Syria and Saudi Arabia, which had been chosen by the Arab League to represent the Arab position on a mission to Washington during the summer of 1982. Such Arab governmental opposition as there was to the war was cheaply bought off with flimsy American promises to issue a brand new U.S. Middle East diplomatic initiative, eventually unveiled on September 1 and later dubbed the Reagan Plan. The initiative would have placed a limit on Israeli settlements and created an autonomous Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but it ruled out a sovereign Palestinian state in these territories. The Reagan Plan, which the United States never forcefully promoted and which was effortlessly torpedoed by the Begin government, ultimately went nowhere. Among Arab public opinion, however, the invasion of Lebanon and siege of Beirut, whose gripping televised images were widely broadcast, provoked great shock and anger. Yet, nowhere was there enough popular pressure on any of the repressive and undemocratic Arab governments to force an end to Israel's siege of an Arab capital or secure better terms for the PLO's withdrawal. There were few mass demonstrations and little open unrest in most of the heavily policed Arab cities. Ironically, perhaps, the largest demonstration in the Middle East provoked by the war took place in Tel Aviv in protest against the Sabra and Shatila massacres. Israelis might have fought the war and suffered casualties, but once again Palestinians found that the foe on the battlefield was backed by a great power from the outset. The decision to invade Lebanon was made by Israel's government, but it could have not been implemented without the explicit assent given by Secretary of State Alexander Haig, or without American diplomatic and military support, combined with the utter passivity of the Arab governments. The green light that Haig gave to Israel for what was supposedly a limited operation was as bright as could be. On May 25th, 10 days before the offensive began, Sharon met with Haig in Washington and laid out his ambitious war plan in explicit detail. Indeed, Sharon gave Haig a much fuller picture than he later presented to the Israeli cabinet. Haig's only response was that there, quote, must be a recognizable provocation, unquote, one that would be, quote, understood internationally, unquote. Soon after, the attempted assassination of Israel's ambassador in London, Shlomo Argov, by the anti-PLO Abu Nidal group provided just such a provocation. Sharon explained to Haig that Israel's forces would eradicate the PLO presence in Lebanon, including all the, quote, terrorist organizations, unquote. The military structures and the political headquarters, which were located in Beirut. This element of the plan alone belied Sharon's description of a limited operation, bellied. Israel would also expel Syria from Lebanon as a byproduct through Sharon piously insisted that he did not want war with Syria and install a puppet Lebanese government. The exposition was clear, as was green light from Haig for a limited operation, noted by the American diplomat who recorded this as the meeting's outcome. While the PLO knew it could expect little support from the Arab regimes in power in 1982, the organization had counted on a sympathetic response from the Lebanese people. However, the PLO's heavy-handed and often arrogant behavior in the preceding decade and a half had seriously eroded popular support for the Palestine cause in general, especially for the Palestinian presence in Lebanon. In a typical incident that occurred near the Institute for Palestine Studies, located in Beirut's Gentile Verdun neighborhood, the guards for a senior PLO leader, Colonel Abu Zaim, who himself was hardly a paragon, shot and killed a young Lebanese couple in their car late one night when they failed to stop at a checkpoint hastily erected near his apartment. Given PLO indiscipline, no one was punished for these deaths. Such inexcusable acts were all too common. Palestinian operations in Lebanon were supposedly constrained within a formal framework, the Cairo Agreement, adopted in 1969, which had given the PLO control of Palestinian refugee camps and freedom of action in much of South Lebanon. But the heavily armed PLO had become an increasingly dominant and domineering force in many parts of the country. Ordinary Lebanese people were aggrieved that this oppressive Palestinian presence was only intensified as the long civil war dragged on. The creation of what amounted to a PLO mini-state in their country was ultimately unsustainable, as it was intolerable to many Lebanese. There was also deep resentment of the devastating Israeli attacks on Lebanese civilians that were provoked by Palestinian military actions. The PLO's assaults in Israel were often directed at civilian targets and visibly did little to advance the Palestinian national cause. If indeed they did not harm it, inevitably all these factors turned important sectors of the Lebanese population against the PLO. An inability to see the intensity of the hostility prompted by its own misbehavior and flawed strategy was amongst the gravest shortcomings of the PLO during this period. So it was that when the moment of truth came in 1982, the PLO suddenly found itself bereft of support from many of its traditional allies, including three key groups. These were the Syrian-allied Amal movement, headed by Nabi Berri, and its large Shiite constituency in South Lebanon in the Bekaa Valley, although young Amal militiamen nevertheless fought valiantly alongside the PLO in many areas. The strategically located Druze fiefdom of Wali Jumblat in the Shuf Mountains, southeast of Beirut, and the Sunni urban populations of Beirut, Tripoli, and Sidon. The backing of Sunni political leaders had been essential to defending the Palestinian political and military presence in Lebanon since the 1960s. It is not hard to understand the reasoning of these leaders and the communities they represented. Southerners, most of them Shiites, had suffered more than any other Lebanese from the PLO's actions. Besides its own violations and transgressions against the population in the south, the PLO's very presence had exposed them to Israeli attacks, forcing many to flee their villages and towns repeatedly. It was understood by all that Israel was intentionally punishing civilians to alienate them from the Palestinians, but there was nevertheless much bitterness against the PLO as a result. Walid Jumblat, whose reasoning was similar, later related that he had no choice but to bow before the overwhelming force of Israel's advance into the Druze region of the Shuf. He may have felt the assurances given by the Druze officers in the Israeli army would secure a measure of protection for his community. He came to regret his decision when, starting in late June 1982, the Israeli military and security services supported the penetration of undisciplined and vengeful Maronite militias into Druze-dominated regions, like Alay and Beit al-Din, where they committed more of the atrocities for which they were notorious. For the Sunnis, in particular those in West Beirut, the bombardment and siege of the Lebanese capital put an end to their staunch support for the PLO, which they had seen as a vital ally against the domination of the Lebanese state by the Maronites and the armed power of their militias. Some may have been stirred by Palestinian calls to turn Beirut into another Stalingrad or Verdun, but most were aghast at the prospect of the city being devastated by Israeli artillery and airstrikes. Defiance of Israel was all well and good, but not at the cost of the avoidable destruction of their homes and property. This was a crucial shift. Without the support of Beirut's largely Sunni population, together with its many Shia residents, prolonged resistance by the PLO to the Israeli offensive was ultimately futile. These calculations led to a severe erosion of the already weakening support for the PLO, which diminished further during the early days of fighting. When the south and the Shuf were overrun, Beirut was bombarded and encircled, Syria dropped out of the war, and Philip Habib relayed Israel's harsh demands for the PLO's immediate and unconditional evacuation. A few more weeks into the war, however, the leaders of the three Lebanese Muslim communities changed their positions significantly and became more supportive of the PLO. This shift came after the PLO consented to withdraw from Beirut in exchange for ironclad guarantees for the protection of the civilians who would be left behind. On July 8th, the PLO presented its 11-point plan for withdrawal of its forces from Beirut. This plan called for establishing a buffer zone between Israeli forces in West Beirut, coupled with a limited withdrawal of the Israeli army, the lasting deployment of international forces, and international safeguards for the Palestinian and Lebanese populations, which would be left behind virtually without defenses once the PLO's fighters had departed. On the strength of this plan, the Lebanese Muslim leaders were convinced that the PLO was sincere in its willingness to depart as a move to save the city. Also, they were deeply disconcerted by the mounting evidence of Israel's overt backing for the mainly Maronite LF, since it underlined the vulnerability of their communities in a post-PLO Lebanon dominated by Israel and its militant allies. These concerns have been reinforced by the arrival of the LF militias in the Shuf in late June, and the widespread massacres, abductions, and murders that they carried out there and in the areas of South under Israeli control. At this stage, after 7 years of civil war, such sectarian slaughter was commonplace, and the PLO's forces had served as a primary defender of the country's Muslims and leftists. The Sunni, Shia, and Drew's leaders therefore redoubled their backing for the PLO's demands in the 11-point plan. There is a vital thread of U.S. responsibility that must be followed to understand what happened next. The consequences were not just the result of decisions by Sharon, Begin, and other Israeli leaders, or of the actions of Lebanese militias who were Israel's allies. They were also the direct responsibility of the Reagan administration, which, under pressure from Israel, stubbornly refused to accept the need for any formal safeguards for civilians, rejected the provision of international guarantees, and blocked the long-term deployment of international forces that may have protected non-combatants. Instead, to secure the PLO's evacuation, Philip Habib, operating via Lebanese intermediaries, provided the Palestinians with solemn, categorical, written pledges to shield the civilians in the refugee camps and neighborhoods of West Beirut. Typed on plain paper without letterhead, signatures, or identification, these memos were transmitted to the PLO by Lebanese Prime Minister Shafiq al-Wazan and later enshrined in the records of the Lebanese government. The first of these memos, dated August 4th, cited, quote, U.S. assurances about the safety of the camps, unquote. The second, 2 days later, said, quote, we also reaffirm the assurances of the United States as regards safety and security for these camps in Beirut, unquote. An American note on August 18th to the Lebanese foreign minister enshrining these pledges stated that, quote, the law-abiding Palestinian non-combatants remaining in Beirut, including the families of those who have departed, will be authorized to live in peace and security. The Lebanese and U.S. governments will provide appropriate security guarantees. On the basis of assurances received from the government of Israel, from the leaders of certain Lebanese groups with which it has been in contact, unquote. These assurances were taken by the PLO to constitute binding commitments, and it was on their basis that it agreed to leave Beirut. On August 12th, after epic negotiations, final terms were reached for the PLO's departure. The talks were conducted while Israel carried out a second day of the most intense bombardment and ground attacks on the entire siege. The air and artillery assault on that day alone, over a month after the PLO had agreed in principle to leave Beirut, caused more than 500 casualties. It was so unrelenting that even Ronald Reagan was moved to demand that Begin halt the carnage. Reagan's diary relates that he called the Israeli Prime Minister during the ferocious offensive, adding, quote, I was angry. I told him it had to stop or our entire future relationship was endangered. I used the word Holocaust deliberately and said the symbol of his war was becoming a picture of a 7-month-old baby with its arms blown off, unquote. The sharp phone call impelled Begin's government to halt its reign of fire almost immediately, but Israel refused to budge on the crucial issue of international protection for the Palestinian civilian population as quid pro quo for the PLO's evacuation. The departure from Beirut of thousands of the PLO's militants and fighting forces between August 21 and September 1st was accompanied by a broad outpouring of emotion in West Beirut. Weeping, singing, crowds lined the routes as convoys of trucks carried the Palestinian militants to the port. They watched as the PLO was forced to evacuate the Lebanese capital, with its leaders, cadres, and fighters going to an unknown destiny. They ended up scattered by land and sea over a half-dozen Arab countries. The men and women bound for an uncertain exile, some for the second or third time in their lives, were seen as heroes by many Beirutis for having stood up for 10 weeks, with no external support to speak of, to the most powerful army in the Middle East. As their convoys rolled through Beirut, no one was aware that a sudden and unilateral American decision, taken under Israeli pressure, meant that the international forces supervising the evacuation, American, French, and Italian troops, would be withdrawn as soon as the last ship left. Israeli bureaucracy and U.S. acquiescence had left the civilian population unprotected. In the Zarif neighborhood where we lived, only a few buildings had been severely damaged, so we managed to survive the siege of Beirut physically unscathed, although I worried about the lasting effect the war might have on our 2 young daughters. Once PLO forces were gone and the siege was lifted, life slowly began to return to normal, even though Israeli troops still ringed West Beirut and tension remained very high. The seeming normalcy ended soon enough, and we would learn that those assurances delivered to the PLO were not worth the plain white paper they were written on. On September 14th, President-elect Bashir Gemayel, commander of the LF and leader of the Phalangists, was assassinated in a huge bomb blast that destroyed a Phalangist headquarters. This was the trigger for Israel's forces immediately to enter and occupy the western part of the city. Despite promises to the United States that it would not do so, where the PLO had previously been headquartered and where its LNM allies were still located. The following day, as Israeli troops swept into West Beirut, quickly overpowering scattered and fitful resistance from fighters of the LNM, my family and I feared for our safety, as did other Palestinians with connections to the PLO. That is, nearly all Palestinians in Lebanon. They included not only refugees registered and born in Lebanon, but also people with foreign citizenship, work permits, and legal residence like ourselves. Uppermost in all of our minds was the Phalangist massacre in the Tal al-Zatar refugee camp in 1976, where 2,000 Palestinian civilians had been slaughtered. In light of the Israeli-LF alliance, the PLO had specifically cited Tal al-Zatar in its 11-point plan, and during the negotiations over its evacuation. Our fears were, of course, compounded by the murders that had been carried out by the LF forces in areas recently occupied by Israel, and by Israel's depiction of the PLO as terrorists, with no distinction made between militants and civilians. The morning after Gemayel's assassination, amid the sound of heavy gunfire, we heard through the open windows of our apartment the approaching roar of diesel engines and the clanking of tank treads. The din was pronounced by the Israeli armored columns advancing into West Beirut. We knew that we had to get to safety quickly. I was fortunate to reach Malcolm Kerr, the president of the AUB and a good friend, who immediately let us take refuge in a vacant faculty apartment. Mona, my mother, my brother, and I loaded our girls and a few hastily packed things into 2 cars and sped to the university just before Israeli troops arrived at its gates. The next day, September 16th, I was sitting with Kerr and several of my UAB colleagues on the veranda of his residence when a breathless university guard came to tell him that Israeli officers at the head of the column of armored vehicles were demanding to enter the campus to search for terrorists. Kerr rushed off to the university entrance, where he later told us he rejected the officers' demands. Quote, "There are no terrorists on the AUB campus," unquote, he said. Quote, "If you're looking for terrorists, look in your own army for those who've destroyed Beirut," unquote. Thanks to Malcolm Kerr's courage, we were temporarily safe in a faculty apartment at the AUB, but we soon heard that others were at that moment in mortal peril. On the same night, September 16th, Raha and I were perplexed as we watched a surreal scene. Israeli flares floating down in the darkness in complete silence, one after another, over the southern reaches of Beirut, for what seemed like an eternity. As we saw the flares descend, we were baffled. Armies normally use flares to illuminate a battlefield, but the ceasefire had been signed a month earlier. All the Palestinian fighters had left weeks ago, and any meager Lebanese resistance to Israeli troops' arrival in West Beirut had ended the previous day. We could hear no explosions and no shooting. The city was quiet and fearful. The following evening, two shaken American journalists, Lauren Jenkins and Jonathan Randall of the Washington Post, among the first Westerners to enter the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, came to tell us what they had seen. They had been with Ryan Crocker, who was the first American diplomat to file a report on what the three of them witnessed, the hideous evidence of a massacre. Throughout the previous night, we learned the flares fired by the Israeli army had illuminated the camps for the LF militias, whom had sent there to mop up as they slaughtered defenseless civilians. Between September 16th and the morning of September 18th, the militiamen murdered more than 1,300 Palestinian and Lebanese men, women, and children. The flares that had so puzzled my brother and me are described from a very different perspective in Waltz with Bashir, a film and book co-authored by Ari Fulman. An Israeli soldier during the siege of Beirut, Fulman was stationed on a rooftop at the time of the massacre with a unit that launched the flares. In Waltz with Bashir, Fulman refers to concentric circles of responsibility for the mass murder that was facilitated by this act, suggesting that those in the outer circles were also implicated. In his mind, quote, the murderers and the circles around them were one and the same. The murderers and the circles around them were one and the same, unquote. The statement is as true of the war as a whole as it is of the massacres in Sabra and Shatila. A commission of inquiry set up after the events, chaired by Israeli Supreme Court Justice Yitzhak Kahan, established the direct and indirect responsibility of Begin, Sharon, and senior Israeli military commanders for the massacre. Most of those named lost their posts as a result of both the inquiry and the general revulsion in Israel over the massacres. However, documents released by the Israel State Archives in 2012 and the unpublished secret appendices to the Kahan Commission reveal even more damning evidence of these individuals' culpability, which was far greater than the original 1983 report lays out. The documents expose long deliberated decisions by Sharon and others to send the practiced phalangist killers into the Palestinian refugee camps with the aim of massacring and driving away their populations. They also show how American diplomats were repeatedly browbeaten by their Israeli interlocutors and failed to stop the slaughter that the U.S. government had promised to prevent. According to these documents, after the entire PLO military contingent had left Beirut at the end of August 1982, Begin, Shamir, Sharon, and other Israeli officials falsely asserted that some 2,000 Palestinian fighters and heavy weaponry remained in the city in violation of the evacuation accords. Shamir made the claim in a meeting with an American diplomat on September 17th, even though the United States government knew for certain that this was not the case. Sharon himself told the Israeli cabinet a day earlier that, quote, 15,000 armed terrorists had been withdrawn from Beirut, unquote. Moreover, Israeli military intelligence undoubtedly knew that this number included every single regular PLO military unit in Beirut. Sadly, American diplomats did not challenge Israeli leaders on their spurious figures. Indeed, documents show the U.S. officials had difficulty standing up to the Israelis over anything to do with their occupation of West Beirut. When Moshe Arens, Israel's ambassador in Washington, was obliged to listen to a series of harsh talking points read to him that were drafted by Secretary of State George Shultz, who by then had taken over from Haig, accusing Israel of, quote, deception, unquote, and demanding the immediate withdrawal of its troops from West Beirut, Arendz responded with scorn, quote, "I'm not sure you guys know what you are doing," unquote. He told Lawrence Eagleburger, the Deputy Secretary of State, and called the American points, quote, a fabrication, quote, unquote, and, quote, completely false, unquote. Eagleburger suggested that the State Department might issue a statement calling Israel's occupation of West Beirut, quote, contrary to assurances, unquote. At which point Arendz's deputy, the 33-year-old Benjamin Netanyahu, weighed in, quote, "I would suggest you delete this," unquote. He said, quote, "Otherwise, you give us no choice but to defend our credibility by setting the record straight. We'll end up in a shooting war with each other," unquote. After listening to an aside from Netanyahu in Hebrew, Arendz added, quote, "I think that is right," unquote. Rarely in history has a junior diplomat of a small country spoken thus to a senior representative of a superpower and been supported in doing so. I'm on page 160. Gonna stop there. Thank you guys for being here. Appreciate you. As always, see you at the next one.